this lecture, I'm going to talk about the differences between authentic and non-authentic listening material. Firstly, let's define what we mean by authentic material. Authentic listening material is any kind of listening material, and it can be scripted or otherwise, which is not produced for second language learning. Most of the listenings we find in commercially produced course books are non-authentic material. They may strive for authenticity, but I define them as being non-authentic. The notion of a semi-authentic piece of material is the kinds of materials that I've described that teachers produce themselves. They're definitely not scripted, and they aim to be as authentic as possible, but they can't claim to be authentic per se because they are being produced for language learners. What I'm concerned with here is the distinction between authentic and non-authentic material. That is the kind of materials, non-authentic listening materials you'd find in a course book. Before we look at some of the differences between authentic and non-authentic listening material, I just want to kind of talk a little bit about the differences between speaking and writing and the process of speaking. This draws on the insights of Wallace Chafe, who made a distinction not according to the modes of speaking and writing, but as to whether these modes, the spoken mode and the written mode, are planned or unplanned. And so we can see that the spoken mode of a lecture is more closely associated, say, with the written mode of a scientific article, because it's something that's planned. And likewise, if we look at something which is unplanned, a letter or email, instant message, is more similar to conversation, even though it's different mode, writing and speaking. One of the central ideas that Chafe put forward, which is very important for understanding speaking and therefore listening, is the idea of an idea unit. And idea units are spontaneous, unplanned, spoken language produced in a series of spurts or idea units. So let's unpack that. An idea unit is spoken with a single coherent intonation contour. Let's think of something like, "What's your name?" And that's one single contour. Or let's take another example. "What the hell are you doing?" And that's another complete intonation contour. It is preceded and followed by some kind of hesitation, some kind of pause. And it's a clause or a one-verb phrase. We don't usually consider complex sentences with subordinate clauses as being part of an idea unit. Interestingly, Chafe actually specifies it as being something like about 7 words long and takes about 2 seconds to produce. That might seem a little strange, but let's go on and try and understand what he means by specifying 7 words and 2 seconds. And he's talking about here is the notion of a focus of consciousness. So an idea unit contains all the information a speaker hearer can handle or process or produce in a focus of consciousness. So when we're speaking in these 7-word spurts because that's our processing mechanism, which is quite different to writing, where we can process much longer stretches of language. And likewise, when we're listening, we're able to unpack these particular idea units of 7 words or so, whereas if we heard something much longer, it would be much harder for us to process. An idea unit expresses the amount of information a person can comfortably pay attention to and verbalize. And an idea unit expresses what is held in short-term memory at a particular time, 7 words long or so. And the short-term memory changes about every 2 seconds. So this is his particular very interesting insight into the cognitive mechanisms of speaking and listening and the processes involved of encoding and decoding messages. Okay, so now I'm going to look at the differences between authentic and non-authentic material. And what I'm going to argue is that many of these particular distinctions can be found in a lot of non-authentic listening materials which you can find in course books. Hopefully you don't find too many of these, but these are some of the kinds of issues you might want to consider when you are choosing a course book and you're listening to the listening materials. In non-authentic material, there is firstly an exaggerated intonation, and this is usually wide and there's an unusually frequent pitch movement. It goes up and down like mothers to babies. So for example, "What's your name?" has an unusually large movement in terms of intonation. And one of the reasons why non-authentic material has this is because it's trying to exaggerate, it's trying in the materials designer's terms, trying to make it more accessible to understand. But whether that is the case or not, you can draw your own conclusions. Second, it tends to have exaggerated enunciation. Words are enunciated with excessive precision. Our house is a very fine house. If you say things like that, what you're not hearing are the kinds of effects of the rules of fast speech. And there are processes, many processes like assimilation, where sounds disappear, and elision, where sounds are joined together. So listen to this and listen to some of the fast speech changes which happen in this pronunciation. Our house is a very fine house. Our house is a very fine house. Okay? Our house is so the strong pronunciation, it becomes very weak schwa sound. So that's what's happening when we speak normally, authentically, naturally. And a lot of that is cleaned up in commercial, non-authentic listening material. 3, what you tend to find in course book listening materials is a very restricted range of accents. Maybe there's a good reason to do this, because we want to take what is the standard pronunciation rather than, say, a non-standard pronunciation. Of course, the problems with this, of course, is it doesn't expose students to different variations of pronunciation in English. So in American English, it tends to be standard American English. We don't have any other kinds of English. We don't have any African American English. We don't have any maybe urban New York English, etc. Similarly in Britain, and again this is changing a lot, but received pronunciation is a very prestige pronunciation, which was used more or less exclusively in most of the listening materials that were produced in British course books, at least. The point here again, as with all these points, is if you're not exposing students to authentic listening material, they're not going to be able to develop the cognitive processes to be able to decode incoming messages. It's going to be too easy. Structural repetition. This is a factor of the focus on forms. Because listenings are scripted in non-authentic material, they tend to flood the particular listening with the same particular structure. Present continuous, for example. I'm looking through the window. I can see my father. He is working in the garden. My brother is sitting in a tree. My sister is playing soccer in the yard, etc., etc. It's not really how we use language. It's language on display. We're displaying particular structural forms. It's not authentic. 5. Because a lot of commercial non-authentic listening materials is scripted, it tends to be written in sentences and not clauses. Remember Chafe's notion of the idea unit. There's these spurts of 7 words. Well, we tend not to find that in coursebook listening material. What we find when we use authentic material is that we have sequences of very loosely connected clauses rather than complete sentences. 6. Distinct turn-taking. We don't get any overlapping, we certainly don't get any interrupting, and of course that's part and parcel of authentic material, authentic conversation. There tends to be a uniform slow pace, so listeners don't get the chance to familiarize themselves with the relative rapidity and variability in pace of authentic speech. Authentic speech tends to use changes in speed to indicate various factors. It could be the end of a turn, or it could be that information is not that important and it's the slower parts that are more important. But what we do get is there's changes in pace in any delivery. Authentic material allows you to work with that. Non-authentic material tends to be very uniform, slow pace. Listeners don't get the chance to familiarize themselves with the relative rapidity and variability in pace of authentic speech. As opposed to, listeners don't get the chance to familiarize themselves with the relative rapidity and variability in pace of authentic speech. There tends to be a standard length of terms. Speaker A has one term which is about the same length as speaker B. Okay. In normal speech, one speaker tends to dominate the turn taking for a while and then the other. 9. Back-channeling. Back-channeling, or to use the particular technical term which is borrowed from Japanese, which is aizuchi, where we signal that we're listening and we're following and we're interested, and we do this all the time. Back-channeling is yeah, right, sure, etc. And we don't get this in non-authentic material. We don't get any repairs, hesitations, or pauses. So a repair is when you correct yourself. I saw this movie, TV show. Lots of pauses, as you can hear as I'm speaking. Lots of ers, lots of filler words, which allow us to plan the next idea unit. And finally, there is pauses. Do you like my new pants? Yeah, nice. They're real low riders. The pause there has meaning. We pause in a sense because B doesn't really want to give the real opinion of these new pants, that he doesn't like them. So pauses are significant. We don't get any discourse markers usually in non-authentic, commercially produced listening material. Words like well, you know, you see, oh, but still, nevertheless, however, sentence initial, and, starting a sentence with and, what's more, so, which is very common in speech, after all, etc. And for example, following on from the last little conversation we saw about the low-rider pants, did you like the movie? Well, it was okay. So well is a discourse marker that tends to signal that you're not going to agree with the particular, what you think is the particular assumption of the previous speaker. You're going to give something which is maybe, your signaling is going to be kind of contradictory to expectations. 12. Formality. The lexis and the syntax tends to be formal. We might say a pain in the neck rather than a pain in some other part of the body. There's certainly no swearing, and there's not really any slang, and very few colloquial forms. Now, there may be good reason for avoiding some of this language, because it may not be that useful. It may not be that frequent. It may be just too culturally marked. But at the same time, we can't have bland conversations that we're listening to. We want the conversation to be alive. And for it to be alive, we have to move away from formal best behavior speaking to the kinds of way we speak informally. 13. In non-authentic material, there's usually limited vocabulary, and there's certainly a very few cultural references to the real world. And it tends to be decontextualized. Authentic listening is contextualized because it's based upon a lot of prior knowledge, and it is also contextualized within the conversation itself. So this is the notion of shared knowledge, number 14. Here's a typical conversation. I saw you-know-who last night. Has she finished her thing yet? No way. At least she's finished the written part. Notice we don't say the explicit information that we know the other person already knows. I saw you-know-who. Okay, we don't have to name the person. Has she finished her thing? That's a general word referring to something specific, but we don't have to name it as specific because we have shared knowledge about it. No way. At least she's finished the written part of, well, we understand each other. So a lot of authentic material implies a certain amount of shared knowledge and a prior knowledge of particular conversations, what's shared between the two speakers. Ambient noise. You don't hear any background noise when you're listening to non-authentic material. In fact, what you hear is no noise, which kind of makes students suspicious, or at least they're able to identify that this is not authentic material. It's been recorded in a studio. It has that studio feel to it. One of my lectures was interrupted by one of the screams of my children. I wish I could have taken out that ambient noise, but at least you understood something about the authenticity of that recording process. So ambient noise is good. Okay, so what I've done there is taken you through various differences between the kinds of materials you find in a course book, non-authentic, and authentic material. There is a place for non-authentic material, just as there is a case for Nutella. But you wouldn't want to eat it all the time. You need to mix it up with some authentic food, like kale, spinach, yeah, all those wonderful green things. We need a diet that's full of both. We can use non-authentic materials, no need to throw it out completely, but you have to be bringing in authentic material. You have to be thinking about producing your own material which strives to be as authentic as possible. That's what we've called semi-authentic material.